Today's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com, where this week we are hosting a year-end blowout sale. We have thousands of items up for grabs, ranging from sealed product to singles to gaming supplies, with discounts going all the way up to 90%. So treat yourself to something nice this week until Sunday, January the 2nd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time at StarCityGames.com/sale.
What's up, gamers? Ryan Overturf here to remind you to check out the 540, Star City Games' very own Cube podcast, where every week myself and Justin Parnell will be tackling topics regarding all things Cube Draft. We're talking set reviews, digital Cube retrospectives, archetype breakdowns, tons of tips on both how to design your own cube as well as play other people's cubes, with plenty of nonsense interspersed. If you're into Cube Draft, we would love it if you gave us a listen, and if you're not, maybe we can fix that. Check out the 540 every week right here on StarCityGames.com and wherever you find your podcasts.
This week's episode of Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, your first stop for Magic the Gathering inspired stylings. Visit coalesceapparel.shop to pick up a t-shirt inspired by fan favorite Magic personalities, a hoodie from your favorite guild in the Ravnica University line, or just signal your intent to snag Keep in the Dark with an anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club sticker. Want to splash up a commander deck? Check out the Keeping It 100 sticker line and see if your favorite commander shows up there. Whatever you order, use code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your purchase at coalesceapparel.shop. Coalesce Apparel. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 38 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, I'm here with Ari Lax, and it is the season to be jolly, and the best way to do that I found is to talk about the modern ban list. So here we are to do that one final time.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so many cards. I think there's, 41 unique cards plus duplicate artifact lands, something like that. And I think we're down to the last 14 or so based on what we've discussed. I think just to wrap up our previous discussions, a lot of these things definitely deserve to be banned. It's not like there's a bunch of stuff that you should revisit after Modern Horizons 2 and say, maybe this is okay. It's like, no, Hogak is still a problem.
Yeah, it's almost like some of these cards, if you told me at the time that you banned them, at some point it will make sense to unban this card. That's almost more terrifying as a glimpse into the distant future and for what's to come. But I don't know if we're saving the best for last here, either in the sense of these are the best cards on the modern ban list, or these are the ones that will lead to the most interesting and constructive discussions.
I think that at the least we have saved the ones for last that are the ones that repeatedly generate the most discussion. I'm trying to think what other, I guess Green Sun Zenith we have already discussed, and looting, but I think people know in their heart of hearts that looting is like actually a bad guy. Green Sun, we kind of came to the conclusion that it's a little closer, but like it might just be a little too much with Titan. But I think some of the cards here don't have those kind of like cross connotations with like existing stuff and are worth just discussing on their own merits, and whether they should, be removed based on people's some kind of nostalgia for them. I don't want to spoil opinions, but they have some kind of nostalgia.
They sure do. And we do still have the single most contentious card, I think, by a lot of metrics on the modern ban list to get to in that segment here. But as always, at the top, we will rattle quickly through the results from the weekend. And it is Christmas weekend, a fairly quiet time for Magic Online for the most part. And someone decided on this weekend they did not want their Christmas being ruined by Ragavan one more time. They really went all out to try and prevent that.
Yeah, I was really impressed with this. I had written up an article like going over the various ways you can build Hammer that just got posted, I guess, yesterday when this posts or whatever on Star City Games. And I was kind of like noting like, well, there isn't really a Azorius Hammer deck. And just as I was submitting it just onto the wire, Azorius Hammer was posted as winning the challenge this weekend. And it's a pretty interesting build. Like you said, it is very clearly making a statement that it's trying to beat the fair decks. One of the things so we have talked a few times over the last few weeks about the Crusher Bot version of Hammer that elects to not play Lurrus of the Dream Den and instead has a tutor package for Nettle Cyst. And I guess this list that won has Cauldra Complete as well. But basically that's kind of it's worse in the mirror because the sideboarded games come down to Lurrus so often. But it's really, really good against the fair decks where like Lurrus can be a little bit slower and a Nettlecyst is just like a big boom that beats your opponent and like lets you keep more hands and is really great. And this takes it a step further by just playing 1,000,000 protection from red cards in 3 Breton Forge Tender, 2 Sanctifier and Vex main deck, and then the rest of both of those playsets in the sideboard.
It is wild, yeah. And we even have the Cauldron Complete, which you would think, Lurrus considerations aside, that would be a shoo-in for an equipment-focused Stoneforge Mystic deck. We have not seen that even in a lot of the Crusher bot lists, by my recollection. But you see it here, and I think part of that is when you have main deck, once again, main deck, Barton Forge Tender, you can actually rely on untapping with Stoneforge Mystic a whole lot more often than you could in the past.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it also makes sense why this list is lower on Steel Shaper's Gift. In the Crusher bot deck, the 4 Steel Shaper's Gift is really important because it effectively turns your Nettlecyst into a companion, just a card that you constantly have access to, and that every single game, like, if your opponent starts messing with your creatures, you can just like play a Nettlecyst and suddenly they have to kill every Memnite you play. And this list is kind of going around that, like you said, with the Forge Tender line. The only other thing to note, we did say this deck has blue. So that's entirely in the sideboard and is for some interesting selections.
Yeah, I know back when the Cascade decks were ruling the roost in Modern, people joked around about what if we played Hammer with Spellstutter Sprite or Lavinia or some of these other creative solutions. I did once play against Charlie the Banana King, friend of the podcast, although that might be a parasocial relationship one way, who's to say, with a similar version of this deck playing Teferi Time Traveler, which kind of makes a lot of sense once you think about it from a certain angle. But this list goes in a different direction here. So we have Mana Leak in the sideboard, a nice all-purpose kind of casual answer there, as well as Thieving Skydiver, which if you're looking for a way to bust open the mirror, that one's got to be near the top of the list.
Yeah, so I kind of disagree with that. My experience in the mirror is that a lot of sideboard games come down to, I mean, sometimes someone gets, hit with a hammer and that happens. Surviving that's kind of tough, and I guess Skydiver is like a pretty specific like spot where like you survive it and untap with a Skydiver. But a lot of games come down to just like Lurrus looping Cathar Commando, and like this list literally cannot destroy an opposing Lurrus, and it feels like the kind of thing where you're like setting up for this game that I don't know if it necessarily happens in the sideboarded games. Though you can just like, if you need to go fast, board in your Skydivers and just use them as additional ways to pick up Hammer, which is totally fine.
Yeah, you could, in theory, have a Lurrus build of Hammer that does have the blue for either of these cards, including Thieving Skydiver. And I'm almost surprised in a way that we don't see that given the focus on Barrington Forge Tender and Sanctifier on deck, because the Forge Tender Lurrus loop, where Forge Tender protects Lurrus and then you can buy back the Forge Tender with the Lurrus, that seems like a pretty feasible endgame to shoot for against any of the removal-heavy red decks. And I guess you then lose out on the maximizing your Stoneforge Mystic lines with that, when you don't have stuff like Nettlecyst and Cauldron, but it feels like you can kind of have your cake and eat it too in that regard.
That is pretty interesting, and maybe that's something players should examine in the future. I know that this list also finished in 17th in the Sunday Challenge, so pretty good weekend for this player, Mario Gomez 097, and I'm interested to see if there is more progress to be made on this moving forward.
Yeah, Mana Leak is kind of interesting. When I was fiddling around with blue in Hammer, one of the big draws to that for me was Metallic Rebuke. And I think in this list, because it is deliberately a little bigger and a little clunkier, I don't know if Rebuke is actually that reliable in this deck, where you don't have Memnite as the second zero-cost creature. We only have 2 Springleaf Drum as like a cheap artifact, which is, I guess, either tapping 4 mana or tapping 4 Improviser in that case. So having the card which will cost 2, as opposed to the card which hopefully costs 1, but could cost as much as 3, and that's kind of catastrophic, maybe is the safer line there.
Yeah. As a side note on Springleaf Drum, I would note that I do like, I don't like Paradise Mantle in the traditional Hammer list, but in this list specifically, I have liked I think the first copy of Paradise Mantle, or the first copy of Springleaf Drum goes a long way. I think after that, you can debate whether you want Paradise Mantles over the additional copies. Just like the things that card does when you start Pure Steel Paladining are a bit more important when you are trying to do things like move around a Sword of Fire and Ice or whatever, as opposed to like the normal hammer list, which is just like really focused on like mana efficiency up the line. So you end up in this spot where like Springleaf Drum can tap something you just played, whereas Paradise Mantle can't. But like I said, if you're trying to like do crazy stuff with other equipment, then the like Pure Steel Paladin thing where you like move your Paradise Mantle around to like 4 things and then like play your Nettle Cyst and equip it in the same turn or whatever starts to come up.
Yeah, one other interactive piece that stood out from this list was the Blacksmith's Skill. Try saying that 5 times fast in the sideboard here. So this is a under the radar MH2 card. This is white for an instant. Target permanent gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. And if it's an artifact creature, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So this is a good way of saving not just any of your creatures, but also Sigarda's Aid, Urza Saga, Colossus Hammer itself, even any of the equipment from whatever interaction the opponent is bringing to bear. And this is exactly the type of card that gets quite a bit worse when the opponent knows about it. But for the first weekend, when you decide to bust out this card, you will take a lot of people by surprise.
Yeah, I know we've seen a copy or two of this in Hammer List throughout the last few months, but not often. And I think that if you're going to play it, this like 1 of 2 of is kind of the right spot. I think drawing more than 1 in a game is just going to be catastrophic. But the first copy can create the scenarios where you just win.
Yeah, I almost wonder if one of the more common use cases here is just going to be protecting your Urza Saga, right? Where we have Forge Tender and some other layers of protection for the creatures, and the deck is constructed in such a way where just one removal spell on a Pure Steel Paladin or something isn't usually game over. But you have fewer ways, and I don't even know what the other options would be necessarily to protect Urza Saga, but that is your most important tool in many matchups. So it's nice to have some kind of line of defense for that one too.
Yeah, I think that's probably most important against like the Spreading Sea setup out of 4 color, where like it's going to interact with other interaction. That's kind of incidental. You're not under the weird Chalice threat where like there's this problem with a lot of hammer lists, I think, lately, like specifically the Ancient Stirrings one, where you're like, I'm going to try to set up a long game against Chalice of the Void with 1-drops. It's just, it doesn't work out the way you want it to. Mm-hmm. But if you're like Blacksmith skilling against a 4-color opponent, that probably does work out the way you want it to.
Moving down into second here, we have Arkham, who you may remember from putting up just absurdly consistent results with Burn week in, week out when that deck had a bigger metagame share. They've moved on to a different aggressive Boros deck here, and this is Boros Prowess, but in recent weeks that has come to mean this slightly bigger deck with stuff like Chandra Dresticle or main deck Bloodwind and so on. And this is much more what I think you would jump to at first glance with Boros Prowess. It's 4 Light Up the Stage, 4 Reckless Impulse to keep the cards flowing, and then 4 Lava Dart. Have not seen that one in a while. A little more Burn in the main deck too, and then more removal as well. We have Prismatic Ending and Path to Exile rounding out the 16 1-drops at play in this deck here.
Yeah, I mean, this is just like Prowess from 8 months ago, right? Like the early 2021 Prowess deck that just has all the 1-drops in. Reckless Impulse, probably a pretty large addition here in terms of like mixing up what you're trying to do. It's kind of interesting that like the selection is Impulse so that you can play Prismatic Ending and Path instead of like Expressive Iteration so you could play Vapor Snag. I don't know quite what that means. I just wanted to put that on the table. I do guess it does give you Luris to do that, but I guess you could maybe 3-color it up.
Yeah, there's a fair few white sideboard cards here too. We have Core Firewalker as the Mirror Breaker against other red decks. Not main decking those, not going so far as Mario Gomez did, but nice to have that tool in your arsenal. And then also we have Deflecting Palm, Wear Tear, the other 2 copies of Path to Exile, and the 4th Prismatic Ending in the sideboard too. So a loud statement that the white cards are worth that splash from Fracom there. And I don't know how it has to feel to get to the finals of a Modern Challenge with your red aggro deck on Christmas Day and run into Game 1, Turn 1, Belgian Force Tender.
Yeah, oops. I do want to call out Deflecting Palm as a pretty smart choice if you are expecting a lot of Amulet Titan, but also a lot of Belcher. One of the things that these decks are very good at doing is giving not giving the Belcher opponent a lot of time to determine the way they want to go about winning. So like Deflecting Palm does constrain their options a little bit. Like they can't just play their Belger from hand as reliably. There is kind of they can like get around it with Recross and leaving in a Pact negation. But that's just like a bad card in their deck, and basically every other circumstance, they don't want that in their deck.
Yeah. Anything else stand out to you from the Saturday challenge here?
The Gruul deck in third place is kind of interesting. It's feels like the kind of deck that I would not want to be playing if I expected Murktide Regents and Death Shadows. But this top 8 was a little light on those cards, so it seems okay under those conditions. I guess there's 2 copies of Shadow here, but not like, we see a lot more of that in the previous weeks. Though I guess between the 2 challenges, not to spoil a bit, there's a lot of Shadow. The deck is good. And I don't really like playing Gruul decks against 6/6s.
Yeah, Shadow was... it had a decent representation here on the Saturday, and then it was overrunning the Sunday challenge, just absolutely everywhere. I think maybe a full half of the top 16 was a Shadow of some variety or close to that at the very least. So yeah, that deck has not gone anywhere, is not going anywhere for the foreseeable future. And until we see a really radical metagame shift to become hostile towards that deck, then you would think a deck like this is off the table. But if you can slog through those choppy waters, then you can still do okay. I gotta think there's something better than Moonveil Regent as a 4-drop here, but if you ask me, well, okay, name a better 4-drop, I'm not sure I could, so maybe this is the best one on offer?
Yeah, I don't have a good idea of like arbitrary generic 4-drop that you can play. Like there's a number of mythic red dragons that you could put in your deck. Maybe, when Kamigawa comes out, they'll put Atsushi, the new red one that can die into treasures or cards. Like, they're all about the same.
Yeah, there have been, by my count, at least a dozen 4-mana red mythic dragons released in the past 2 months or so. So take your pick, and one of them, I'm sure, will be good enough there. Anything else from Saturday, or are we good to move on?
2 quick hits from the top 16 in terms of weird fair decks. There is a Dimir control deck that just completely throws out the red part of the like Grixis Snapcaster Mage stuff. Like not even playing Ragavan, just like, here are some Dimir cards. This is in 10th place by 3-0. And it's just like a Lurrus controlled deck, kind of harkening back to the Valky Bring to Light decks that Aspiring Spike was playing before Modern Horizons 2, I believe. And not too this is just literally blue and black cards, but it's interesting that it is able to be successful. And it might be worth looking back at a like Lurrus true control deck under these constraints that is probably a little better against like some of like the Grixis decks that people were building were really bad against Sanctifier because all their cards are like Rakdos, but this deck is just playing Archmage's Charm.
Yeah, back in the brief period where I was getting excited about Inverter again, I won a lot of games with that deck just as a kind of Dimir control deck with discard into Murktide Regent, and didn't really enjoy drawing, Jace Wielder of Mysteries at any point. But hey, this idea of playing all of the good blue and black cards worked out pretty well. So Murktide itself does directly compete with Lurrus, and maybe that is a death knell for it. But something in that space seems like it should be possible.
Yeah, I do wonder if this deck should show up with like at least one dress down just for the... I know like the Lurrus dress down loop against Hammer is really, really good. And I would want access to that potentially, but it's not like a deal breaker kind of thing.
Yeah, I do think that becomes more important when you are a hard control deck. You do need to answer literally everything. And this deck, you do have Spreading Seas to answer Urza Saga, but always nice to have some backup there. And then, yeah, dress down, just a wonderfully flexible card across the board. You don't get to do any of the Death Shadow or Croaxa tricks with it in this deck, but just as a flexible answer that can cycle itself at instant speed, I think having that one copy at the very least to open up that loop with Lurrus is a good thing to do.
Yeah, and then jumping down to 15th place, we have Domain Naya, which is just like, so this is Keeper X playing it. It's just like 4 Ragavans and Naya cards with Sign of Draco and Territorial Kavu also showing up the curve. Just like a lot of good 2s. The interesting part of this was that Ranger Captain Evios was showing up just like finding Ragavan and nothing else. And I guess this kind of points to like maybe some of what the Gruul deck was doing right against Murktide, which is leaning really hard into endurance to handle that, just a bunch of main deck endurances.
Yeah, there's not even a Boneton Fortender in the sideboard or like a giant killer or whatever nonsense is. Yeah, the only target for this is Ragavan. What's wrong with that? I'm playing the good cards and I want to find my good card every single time. I do really enjoy the Embercleave in this deck to pair with the Stoneforge Mystic. That's a tactic which, like, there aren't that many non-hammer Stoneforge Mystic decks going around, and not all of those have red or have enough red to fit in the Embercleave, but I think it's a really nice thing to have access to if the stars align in the right way there.
Yeah, I like the fact that the sideboard is admitting that 4 Solitude off of 4 Ending, 4 Stoneforge is like a little tight. So it's boarding in Winds of Abandon additionally, just like really pushing into what if I have the most possible removal, but also positioned in such a way that if I play against, say, Yawgmoth and end up in these stupid grindy games, I have some crazy out to that.
Yeah, sometimes you just need a counter spell to pitch your Force Negation, you know?
Yeah, I just also had to double check which abilities Scion of Draco was granting things to make sure it was relevant. I don't really think it is. I think the problem with Scion of Draco is that the best abilities are blue and black, and no one ever puts it in a deck with blue and black creatures.
Yeah, if you say that you have memorized all of the abilities on Scion of Draco, I will snap call that. I literally don't believe you.
Yeah, it's I just honestly forget that it has that text because it's just too often, 2 mana 4/4 flying blank, and it's just one of those things like, oh, I'm playing a bunch of colors. Does this? No, it never lines up. Never, ever in a million years.
Yeah, let's head over to Sunday here, where, as we said, a full half of the top 8 was Shadow, and I'm doing a very quick scan of the top 16 here, and
it's not quite Shadow, but there's like a lot of Shadow adjacent stuff going on that makes up that half. So I think there's 3 Shadow decks in the top 8, and then I think a like fairly traditional Rakdos, but then like 9th place is like the no Shadow Grixis deck and like a bunch of other Shadow down the line. The notable thing out of these decks was one of the top 8 lists, I believe, has a hidden Godless Shrine to splash Kaya's Guile out of the sideboard, which I thought was kind of cool.
That's kind of cute. Is that worth the squeeze there as a Mirror Breaker, or is it just so good across the board, like against Burn? You can imagine that being great, for example, that is it more of a flexibility thing or more of a hammer?
I'd have to imagine it's a flexibility thing where, like, if you named the card, I guess this also has ending in the main too, which feels kind of obligated once you're going down that road. But I don't even know if I want that. I think that like the cost of having a Godless Shrine in your deck in order to have Kaya's Guile on the sideboard, like that card's a lot of coverage, right? Good against the Mirror, good against Burn, good against Dredge. Like those are 3 problem matchups, right?
Yeah, we do also see a slight resurgence of Living End, a copy in 10th and a copy in 13th. And if you go back 3 months ago, that would be almost a poor weekend for Living End. You'd expect at least one of the top 8 and then a few more scattered throughout the top 16, top 32. But at this point, I think they'll take what they can get.
Yeah, I think there were a few more scattered across the prelims as well. So I think Living End is having a bit of a resurgence. We'll have to see if that pans out in the next couple of weeks or not. But there's not a lot of Chalice, so this might be a good time for it.
Yeah. So I think that will do it for the weekend results. Let's take a short break and we'll come back with the final segment on the Modern Ban List.
If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than selling to StarCityGames.com. With a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry, there's no reason to sell to anyone else. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell. That's SELL for details on all 4 of our great ways to turn your cards into cash or credit. Check out our buy list to sell specific cards, ship your cards to us for an offer with our ship and sell program, schedule an appointment with us at Star City Comics and Games in Roanoke, Virginia for the classic experience of selling to a person, or if you are a store or have over 500,000 cards to sell to us, we can come to you. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell for more details on your preferred way to sell your cards, and let us make it the easiest and best experience selling Magic the Gathering cards that you have ever had.
Okay, so we are back to round out our 3-part discussion here of the Modern Ban List, past, present, and possibly future, I suppose. Do we want to address the elephant in the room here, or should we bury the lead for a little while longer?
I'll let you decide whether we start with the big ones first or lead with the small fries.
All right, well, let's talk about everyone's favorite card on the ban list, not their favorite card being on the ban list, and that is, of course, Splinter Twin, which to this day, any discussion of Modern, whenever some new broken deck comes up, you can be sure to find someone in the YouTube comment section making the point that, oh, well, Splinter Twin was too good for Modern, but we were allowed to do this, or something to that effect. Should we be allowed to do this too? Has the time come to set Splinter Twin free from jail?
Every time I start thinking maybe it's time, I play against Twin in the Vintage Cube, and I'm just like, oh god, why would I ever want to experience this again? So I think we talked a bit about like one of the undesirable combo patterns recently with Second Sunrise and KCI, and I think we kind of forgot to cover this with Glimpse, but it has that, which is like this non-deterministic long combo where you go through your whole deck and your opponent's like, I'm probably dead, but they could like screw it up or accumulate warnings and then get disqualified from the tournament. I don't know. Like they're just forced to sit there and be miserable. Twin is like kind of the exact reverse, where like the terms of the game are never settled as to like when you play against Belcher, you're like, oh, like this is what is going to occur. I'm going to have to beat Belcher. When you play against Twin, like there's never like, it's like I'm going to have to beat like a control deck and then just like randomly die to Twin. I think that experience is like really unattractive, especially for people like it is. I think Twin is one of the like most detrimental things you could put in the format in terms of like new player acquisition, aside from like, I don't know, like Stone Rain, Blood Moon, like you don't get to play your cards is pretty bad. But I think that even if like compared to like KCI, like at least if you play against a good KCI player, it's like weird and aspirational to look at and be like, oh, wow, you can do that. Whereas Twin, you're just like, what? Like why? Like, why does this happen to me?
I think I'm more sympathetic to Twin than I ever have been in the past, and more so than I imagined that I would be if you would ask me even just a few months ago. I think that there's a lot of other stuff competing with Twin in a roughly similar space. So if you go back to 2015, early 2016, there were always people trying to make Grixis Control happen, or some brave soul trying to win games of Magic with Blue Moon back in the day. But ultimately, if you wanted to play, or like Delver of Secrets was and is not still a card in Modern, as it turns out. But if you wanted to play some kind of tempo-ish blue-red deck of some kind, you may as well just play Twin and build it with whatever philosophy you like. Nowadays, there's a lot of other stuff you can do. So do you want to play just straight up Is It Murktide? With all that entails, and I don't think you can easily hybridize that with Twin. There's like, and a lot of the new tools don't really pair well with Twin. So like there wouldn't be a great expressive iteration deck, for example. You can play stuff like Ragavan just as a generally good card and or backup plan in the same vein that kind of Tarmogoyf was for a little bit, but then that opens you up to some of the same interaction. And then on the other side of things, bear in mind that back in 2015, like Fatal Push did not exist yet. It was very difficult to just interact with a creature that had more than 3 toughness. So yeah, you could path to exile if your deck had access to that. Your like Jund deck could dismember it or abrupt decay, I suppose, but the removal just was not good in Modern at that time. Now we have all of those additions, and then also Unholy Heat, Solitude, Force Negation as an answer to the Twin combo itself, if not anything else really going on in that deck. And specifically that ability to interact for free, I think is a big deal there, where the issue with the play pattern with Twin in the past was even just leaving up like mana and one piece of interaction wasn't good enough a lot of the time, where they could either just plow through that or force the issue by tapping down the white source that you left open for Path to Exile and now put you to the test, right? Either you have to leave more mana up and potentially just essentially time walk yourself in the process, or you spend your removal spell now, but then you're not getting anything back and then get to untap with this additional resource. I think it's much easier these days to just do your thing and play your own game, and then also be able to incidentally interact with the Twin combo at the same time. But then maybe the Twin deck just gets to use all of that stuff too, and that would become the best go-to like Unholy Heat deck or what have you.
Yeah, like you're saying this stuff, and I'm just thinking like I would just put Ragavan Expressive Iteration to Fairy and Counterspell into my Twin deck.
Yeah,
that's just what my counter argument is that I think that what happens when Twin, like you're describing the scenarios where it's like, yes, Jund is 55% against Twin, and it's like, okay, that's great. But Twin is still going to be among the best decks because it's still like playing the control mirror margins. And then you end up in a spot where like everyone else trying to play things in the format that are not like semi-controlling mid-range just like ends up not having a good time against Twin. Like the old answer to Twin, at least, was just like play a burn deck, like something where like a specific, you can't play things that are dedicated to like attacking with a single creature because you will just get tapped down with Exarch. So you have to play like Wild Nacatls or like Goblin Guides and just like try and kill your opponent on turn 4 and hope it works because you're like 62% to win that way. And like, I just don't think the experience of like building a deck to beat Twin that is not a mid-range deck is, I don't think it makes the format better. I think it just makes the broad format worse. I think that like the comparable experience right now is like the way the 4-color and Azorius decks kind of had these weird endgames that were like relatively ahead of the other mid-range decks and sort of weirdly unassailable. Like Resolving Omnath is like broadly the same in a like fair mirror match as Resolving a Twin is, but like there's like openings against the broader field that are like actually good, and they're not just like interactive in the sense that like my permanent needed to tap and you didn't let me do that. It's like, oh well, you're gaining life, or like I can't play 1-drops. So like weird like you don't end up with the Belgers of the format when you're playing like when Twin is involved. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah, I expect that Twin would land in the space of being like good, potentially very good, but not too good or obnoxiously good. That being said, I have to wonder what the point is in that case, because maybe this is too cynical of me, but I have a sense that a lot of the Twin nostalgia is hankering for a time when Twin was like the best combo deck and the best interactive deck at the same time, and where if you were a competent Twin player, yeah, you could run circles around most opponents, and then also you would pick up your free however many percent against the people who had not played against Twin before and who played against it once and then maybe did not really want to keep playing Modern past that point. But I think if you unban Twin and it becomes just one more good deck, but then the people who are playing Twin find themselves getting solituded a lot or losing to Shadow, which didn't really exist in any familiar form back then, but would be, I think, a good like anti-Twin countermeasure now. Is that what you were sincerely hoping for? Were you hoping that you could play this play pattern again and have it be just one more good thing? Or were you secretly hoping for the times where, you know, you play Twin and it felt like nothing else could really touch what you were doing?
Yeah, and I do want to make a point that my experience playing Shadow against Twin, because I did like back when there was, I forget what event it was. There was an event where the pre-Shadow lists, like the more like aggressive ones existed. Paying life against Twin is like a losing battle. Like, you know that, I mean, it might be different now because they aren't a Snapcaster deck, but like one of the issues with any Shadow list against Twin in those eras was that you just exposed yourself to like Snap, Bolt, Pestermite, you're dead. Like you would just lose to their cards attacking you, and it kind of sucked. So I'm not sure, like, I don't even know. It's kind of like weird. Like Murktide Regent just like being tapped down. That doesn't sound great. Like you're like, there's a lot of like things that would just be like, yeah, we're just like, you know, Rakdos Mardu pile trying to beat this deck. It's like, yeah, that's, you know, Jund all over again. I agree with you. Like, I don't know what the nostalgia for playing Twin is for. Like, I don't see what part of the Twin experience is like interesting or fun beyond like, you know, like you and a friend are like playing like weird heads up matches against Twin for like the psychology value. I don't think it is a broadly fun deck to reintroduce into a metagame if it's going to be reasonably good.
Yeah, the argument in the past, and however much of this was motivated reasoning, I don't know, but taking it at face value for now, the argument in the past was Twin was the safety valve that ensured the format against a lot of either the out of bounds combo nonsense, like the KCIs and Amulet Titans of the world, or just against the boring stuff like the Valakers and just things which are very linear and one-dimensional. Twin tended to line up pretty well against, whereas the decks that had to play like a diverse mix of interaction, and we got some threats, we got some interaction over here and some removal. That was a decent recipe against Twin, and those games of Twin against those decks were usually pretty fun and pretty back and forth. Now, though, we have ways to keep all of the nonsense in check. A lot of it has been banned out of the format. You know, we don't have Faithless Looting or Mox Opal anymore. We'll get to some of the other possible nonsense contenders on this list in a little bit. But we also have just all of the Forces and Solitude and Unholy Heat and Grief, and just, if you want to beat these linear decks now, you can do it almost no matter what your deck is. And so I think that argument, if it ever did apply, just doesn't really apply anymore. I think that there are other decks doing that on behalf of Twin, and maybe doing it better than Twin ever did in its prime.
Yeah, I do want to cite one specific argument from the Twin ban, was that they were just like, yeah, we had Is It Twin, and then like people won an event with like Jeskai, and then we just had Jeskai Twin, and then like there was also just Teamer Twin. And if we just banned Twin, we would just have like Jeskai, Teamer, Is It, and Grixis. And they would all just be good decks in their own right without Twin. And I don't think that it's fine. I think it is better when the homogenizing pieces are cogs that like let you build around them, rather than just like, oh, the game has ended with Splinter Twin yet again, regardless of what colors my opponent is playing.
I think that argument almost failed on its own terms back then, because they banned Twin, and then I think the next week someone won a tournament with like Teamer Delver, and people got very excited, and that was it. Like, no one won a tournament with the blue deck except like Corey Burkhart sometimes for the entirety of the next 24 months. But nowadays, I think you do actually have other ways to build blue decks, other things that would go in those shells, and I don't know if introducing this competition in the form of Twin, I think it might lead to some interesting, do I play this shell? Do I play that shell? But I think that trade-off is actually more real now than it was in the past. And whichever direction that leads you in is up to you. But I think the trade-offs here are totally different.
Yeah, I'm just like more into trusting actual cards that like do things that are unique in the game, rather than just like something that's hitting the win button. I don't think the Twin experience is like significantly fun on any end. Like the experience of just like playing Twin and like I just like so many games just come down to this like effect where you just like EOT Exarch, and then you're like 6% to win on your next draw step because you don't have it yet, but you might. And then like I just don't think that is like a continuously fun experience. Like, you haven't really crafted a game where that happens. You've just like taken a single game action, and then like that's it. Like there's no window usually. It's just I don't know. It's not great. It's not great.
I do think some of that nostalgia too was for the Twin mirrors, where because Twin was the only blue deck and it was pushing out other blue decks and homogenizing that part of the format. If you wanted that experience of these highly interactive blue mirrors, and Twin was arguably better at that than the average like Jeskai control mirror or whatever, then Twin offered you this really intricate, really unique gameplay experience if you prepared against another competent Twin pilot. But now you can still access a lot of that. You have, the Sunday challenge that we just spoke about, I imagine involved a lot of shadow mirrors as we got down that home stretch. Or we have Murktide now, we have other stuff going on to where that is actually just much more embedded in the format now than it used to be. That kind of interaction heavy, but very like high tension, very swingy games back and forth. We have that now, and we don't need Twin to offer that. And so it feels like I think I am more optimistic about Twin being safer than you are. But in terms of like, what does this actually add to the format in a positive way? I agree with you that I'm not seeing what's there anymore.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I think Twin is in the camp of it will do nothing besides like maybe excite some 2013 tournament grinder, or it will be miserable for people for a long time until it's banned again. I don't think it's like, I don't know what the good outcome is.
Yeah, let's move on here to talking about some broken blue cards, which were legal for exactly one high-profile modern tournament and then never again. And I imagine probably never again in the future, but never say never, I suppose.
Yeah, so this is Preordain and Ponder. And I've actually snuck a third card in here. And I think this is my crazy stance. I think this is the most likely of these to be unbanned. This is Once Upon a Time. And I think that the lumping of these three cards together sort of tells the story, which is that the question is, what are you trying to subsidize with these cards existing? With Preordain and Ponder, I think that's a little like open-ended. And I don't actually know if Preordain and Ponder are too good in the era of the London Mulligan and Ragavan. I actually would want to put some work into thinking about that. But my thought with Once Upon a Time, aside from the fact that like, I think all these cards suffer from the loading screen problem, which is like a good reason to not have them in the format where like everyone takes their first turn and then like spends, a minute and 45 seconds on mulligan decisions before like taking a mulligan and shuffling, and then like another minute, and then like starts with the Ponder, and like, there's 43 minutes on the clock and you're ending your first turn and you're like, dear God, why? I think that's
it's awful. If for the people out there who asked why you didn't see Legacy on the SUG tour, and is it because they're trying to kill Legacy? No, it's because the format in paper is literally unwatchable, because the entire game is hidden information and people shuffling 3 times a turn and taking 45 seconds to resolve a Ponder, where everything is so opaque and the gameplay experience is so repetitive, on top of the undesirable effects of giving those decks so much redundancy and consistency at the same time. Maybe like if you let loose Ponder but not Preordain, or vice versa, then you get around that last part of that. But that sheer just like experience of your opponent, they crack a fetch land, they cast Ponder, they trigger their Dragon's Mace Channeler. 20 seconds later, they resolve their Ponder, they shuffle again, they draw their card, they cast another spell, they crack their fetch land. It's so monotonous. It just blurs together, and it is more mind-numbing than any 10-minute KCI turn could ever hope to be.
I think that may have like single-handedly sold me on Ponder remaining banned under Sensei's Divining Top rules. And maybe Once Upon a Time. I think the argument for Once Upon a Time is that it doesn't happen repeatedly throughout a game. There's not like too much shuffling, and it subsidizes the right stuff for the most part. Like, the decks that already have access to cantrips can often turn into these heavy cantrip piles where you have like the exact specific answers and some one-ofs, and all you're doing is just like, sorting your cards and creating the hand you want. Whereas Once Upon a Time is like subsidizing your like Yawgmoth and Tron decks, where like maybe, subsidizing Tron doesn't sound as good as I'm saying, but like it's making your green decks more reliable out of the gate, which I guess like the existence of Ignoble Hierarch as redundancy certainly helped with. But I think Once Upon a Time is this may be some of the same issue with Green Sun Zenith, where it's just like, yeah, but Amulet Titan exists. I think that the decks that it makes better are the decks you want to see made better. And I think this discussion, like, I think with the London Mulligan, you get a lot of the consistency of cantrips in anyways. And just like, I guess, Ponder's issues aside, what is Preordain going to make significantly better that you don't want to make better?
I think it makes better just like, is it Murktide, generic, play all the good MH2 cards together that already all cost 1 or 2 mana, and just patch up even the slight inconsistencies that those decks still have, as opposed to, taking some like tier 2.3 linear deck and giving it the boost it needs to rise above a station.
I think that the delta between Consider and Serum Visions and Preordain in the Murktide deck is smaller than like what it would give to just like put that card into a lot of other decks. And I do think that there's some interesting tension that it introduces with like Chalice in the control decks as well, but that might be like a just now kind of thing. Like, I think that Preordain would do a lot of work towards making something like Reanimator good, or like, I guess like Grinding Station. I don't want to say Ad Nauseam because I don't want to get anyone's hopes up, because that deck is just not good. But I'm kind of interested in the prospect of an unbanned Preordain, just talking through it now, and just like, I think that scrying is less of a loading screen and seeing fewer cards Whereas Ponder, just like the physical act of shuffling is the hoop to jump through. I mean, we're living in an all digital world for a while more now, but I think that there has to be a thought about like what happens once you re-enter the physical world. And I've subtly reordered which ones I think Preordain may actually be more raw powerful than Ponder, just because it's so contextless in terms of like not needing a fetch to make it happen. I think that like there's in Legacy, there's just like the double incentive of Brainstorm and Ponder means you just play 8 million fetches and it's all good. Whereas in Modern, like there's incentive to like balance out your mana with painless mana because of the shocks, and like there's actual equity to having Preordain over Ponder. I think it might be the most powerful of the three, but it's also like possibly the most unbannable.
Yeah, I think that Preordain is generally the better card in the abstract, but in a format where there are already so many strong incentives to load up on as many fetch lands as possible, then the pendulum swings in Ponder's direction just by default, and then exacerbates that same problem. Like, I don't think that you need to subsidize fetch lands any further, and when everyone is already shuffling so often, I don't think that exacerbating that with Ponder is the way you want to go. And I don't think you would want to free both of these at the same time, because then you just start off a lot of your blue decks with 4 Preordain, 4 Ponder, and then just fill in the rest from there. And maybe that would be what it takes to make, I don't know, Storm a good deck again, or that 8-pack is the exact kind of boost that some deck would need. But I think it's more likely that you just see, 4 Ponder, 4 Preordain, 4 Expressive Iteration, in your Murktide deck, which now just like has flawless card selection at every stage of the game. And so I think if you let loose one, Preordain is the much better candidate. And when you compare it to Serum Visions, like Serum Visions is such an unsatisfying card to cast. You draw your card and then you vaguely hope that you're getting something nice next turn, unless you're like chaining together 2 more cantrips this turn to finally dig out that card. Preordain is fun. Preordain is, well, okay, let's spin the wheel and let's see what we get right now. And those games where like you keep a 1-lander and you miss your second land, but you draw Preordain, and now you actually have pretty decent odds at getting your way out of the situation. I think Preordain is just a much more fun gameplay experience on both sides than any of the cards in its niche. And so if we have to free one of these, I think Preordain is the way to go. Do you think there is a realistic chance of that happening, or is that just mostly a thought experiment?
I think talking it through now, it's probably the next card in line to be unbanned whenever there is a reason to unban something. I think we're still like in enough of a state of flux that no one needs to just like add cards to the format for whatever reason. But I think that, I don't know, probably somewhere in the like 12 months range, I could see Preordain coming off the list late next year. If things start to slow down a bit.
Yeah, that is my worry, though. It's that it ends up just making decks like Is It Murktide even better? Or, the Phoenix deck that has 16 mopey cantrips gets a turn 4 of those into Preordain, versus it not really being enough to actually bring back any of these kind of like not quite good enough combo control decks. I would almost, if that were the case, I would almost err on the side of just give us both of them back and see what happens, versus, making a problem that already exists worse in that sense. Once Upon a Time is a really interesting proposition to me, because, as you say, I think it's off the table given that, Primeval Titan concerns, and we had a format dominated by exactly that recipe less than 2 years ago. But when you look at what the incentives are to play various decks in the format right now, I'm not sure what the top tier decks are that Once Upon a Time would fit in, other than, maybe giving Yawgmoth and Titan that boost to make them legitimate top tier decks again. And I think that for as much as creature or land is an incredibly broad sweep of cards, it actually misses a lot of the kind of generic stuff going on in the format. So you look at the 4 color decks that we have now, where it's a bunch of like Planeswalkers and iterations, counterspells, and so on. I think Once Upon a Time does nothing for those decks, whereas a more like specialized deck with a clear mission statement like Elementals, which was kind of supplanted by those 4 color decks, that's another deck which would receive a massive boost from Once Upon a Time. And so I think it gives you a good reason to find a thing to build your deck around and to like lean hard into that thing. And I think that's what the format needs more of at the moment, as opposed to here are all the good cards and the superficial costs that they have in terms of, oh, well, you have to reach Delirium. Those are mostly a mirage and you can reach those trivially. I think Once Upon a Time is a good nudge to actually build a deck around something in a good way.
Yeah, I do think, though, the thing that you did not mention was revealing Ragavan off of Once Upon a Time, and that would be the first thing I'd move towards.
Well, sure.
I don't know what shell it would be in, but that would be involved in some way.
Honestly, it might be something like the Gruul deck that we mentioned from the challenge, right? Where you find your Ragavan, you find like Fury, Makers of the Moon, Endurance, stuff like that. Like, and honestly, I don't think that would be the worst thing to incentivize in terms of here is a very fair creature-heavy strategy that plays at the board, and this gives it like a slight jolt that it needs to not be quite so embarrassing anymore.
Yeah, or maybe, putting Ragavan into Elementals or like a Elementals adjacent 4-color deck. Something along those lines. I think the biggest argument against Once Upon a Time is just like having someone take their first turn before the 45 minutes on the clock mark.
Sure.
And I don't know, we'll see how people feel in 8 to 9 months and whether that's like actually a large concern for the format or not.
Mm-hmm. So we'll take another short break and we'll come back with some recent offenders as well as some of the very first offenders from the very early days of Modern. Don't go anywhere.
With this break, I'd like to talk to you about Star City Games Premium. For years, StarCityGames.com has been hosting the best Magic the Gathering strategy content on the internet, and Star City Games Premium is a huge part of that. If you want to see great articles from Pro Tour champions, world champions, and many other accomplished players, as that content comes hot off the presses, subscribe to StarCityGames.com Premium. More than that, Star City Games Premium comes with a host of benefits when shopping at StarCityGames.com. Premium members save 5% on Magic the Gathering Seal product, 10% on singles, and 15% on supplies. There's even special benefits on SCG Tour Online event entries to keep an eye out for when those events come around. All that savings and all that content costs just $7.99 a month. For the price of 2 booster packs, you can be on the cutting edge of Magic the Gathering strategy, getting insights from the best in the industry on Star City Games Premium.
All right, so let's come back for this final batch here in the home stretch, and I guess we could group these somewhat chronologically, or we could just do these in alphabetical order and be like veering back and forth between just completely different eras of Modern and Magic as a whole.
Let's go sort of old to new, because I think that the new ones will go faster just because like a lot of them are just the same context they got banned in, and it's worth discussing like, well, maybe they won't get banned, or I don't know. It's, I some of these is just like, let's get real here. So let's start off. There's a few cards that got banned after Philadelphia that are worth still discussing, starting with Blazing Shoal. I am sympathetic to the Blazing Shoal case under some conditions.
Okay, namely?
I think there is a question about whether you can unban Preordain and Blazing Shoal at the same time. I think that Blazing Shoal is the right kind of combo. So we talked about Twin being the wrong kind of combo. I think it is very important. The Infect decks are stating what is going to occur in the game. Their cards don't just like randomly like happen to you in the same way. And like there's a very clear and defined plan of interacting that doesn't necessarily like. I don't think you can build the Infect deck in the same way the Twin deck is, where it's just like, I don't know, I'm just going to like hit him a couple times with Deceiver Exarch if the worst case happens. It's like, no, like I have a Blighted Agent. It's not going to be a good card unless I'm comboing it with Blazing Shoal. I think that it's not as egregious of a play pattern. The problem is largely just speed and reliability. And I don't know if Blazing Shoal still crosses that threshold or not. Are there other like comparable speed decks in the format at all that like you can think of that kill at that rate? Because it feels like there might be like 1 or 2 decks that are similar aside from Hammer that are just buried by consistency issues.
Yeah, I guess before the looting ban, then like Goryo's Vengeance was kind of in that mix, or but yeah, there's not really anything else otherwise. And Hammer is the comparison that gets made all the time with Blazing Shoal, and you can kind of understand why. But I think that's more of a play pattern thing rather than a raw speed kind of comparison.
Yeah, I think that previously there was a lot of arguments about Inkmoth Nexus being like a relatively unassailable and painful to attack permanent. But I think that in the era of Urza Saga, that's not necessarily true to the same degree. There is like, again, the slight concern of like, oh, you've just created another Teferi deck. How fun. But I don't know. I was down on this deck for a long time, but like thinking more about it, like it's a turn 3 deck, like at the best. I guess the Glistener Elf decks are like more so, but they have their own problems. But I think that the list that people are like truly afraid of are not like the spoils of the vault list. They're like the, presumably would be Force of Negation-ish lists, where you're like trying to do a similar thing to what Living End is doing, where you're just like a fast combo deck with this like inherent interaction. But I don't necessarily think they're too fast for the format.
Yeah, if you think back to Pro Tour Philadelphia, this is a time when the removal on offer was absolutely embarrassing, but it was also embarrassing for that format and for that tournament, where even if you had like Fatal Push, Unholy Heat, Prismatic Ending, Solitude for that tournament, those cards all would have been pretty bad in the face of like Cloud Post and like Rite of Flame Seething Song, which more on that in a second, and so on and so forth. And so those were very good conditions for a deck like Blazing Shoal to thrive, where you were playing against other combo decks where you were faster and more interactive, and the things that were good at interacting with you were not incentivized by the rest of the format at large. And I think the exact opposite of all of that is basically true at the moment, where all of the interaction is really good and the interactive decks are really good, and those decks are trying to like interact with each other using some of those same tools, and a deck like this would get caught in the crossfire there. And this deck was pride of place in that Twitter thread I mentioned last time of banned cards invalidated by Solitude, and for good reason, I think, where, yeah, there are ways you can bob and weave around that, but then that's taking your like 2-point-something card combo and adding yet another requirement on top of that, and I think it would be just fine. Would it be fun to play against or to lose to? No, not really, but I think the format can handle and maybe even need some amount of this, and this is a good thing in that space to encourage.
Yeah, I basically think the argument is that if you ever wanted to consider unbanning Twin, you should try and think about unbanning this card first. I literally think that you should unban this card before unbanning Twin, like not even as like a philosophical thing, but just like in practice as a test case to see like if Twin would be like, if this card is pushing things out of the format, it feels like Twin would do that, but make it worse. So I think Blazing Shoal is like, it is still slightly dangerous to push the format down this direction, because it feels like a lot of things like the Simian Spirit Guide ban have been really pushed at like, you can do broken things this early, but you should not literally end the game at that rate. But I don't think it's like horribly out of line.
Yeah, and I think that it's worth noting that this would be both a decent Force Negation deck, but then also a deck which is pretty weak to Force Negation in terms of like you have to go off and win on your own turn via the combat step, and just all of that opens you up to lots of forms of interaction, which like the Goblin Charbelters of the world don't need to care about. So I think Blazing Shoal would be safe. I don't know if it's likely, but I could see them if they're thinking, what do we do just to inject a little bit of variety? Why not try out some of these cards, which were kind of maybe justifiably banned at the outset 10 years ago, but what better way to kind of bookend these two phases of the format, draw this link between old and new, than to set some of those free and see what happens.
Yeah, I think that this is probably, we were kind of high on unbanning Glimpse, and I think this is also a better version of unbanning Glimpse in terms of like, the play pattern of Infect is just like better than the play pattern of Elves in terms of like creating that misery. You don't have the someone is sitting there waiting for the other person to kill them for like 15 minutes thing. You don't like, if their creature dies, it's not just like, but what if they play another 3 creatures and have cast a Glimpse and draw their deck anyways? It's just like, no, like they have a 1/1 it can attack, or they don't have a 1/1 and I can't die next turn. So I am totally okay with, I'd have to look back at all the cards we listed, but this is probably in the top few in terms of reasonability of unban.
Let's move on to one which I'm not actually sure where you'll come down on this, but Cloud Post, which I know that Urza's Tower has caused many a player to groan in frustration across the years, but never really come close to ban worthiness as far as I can tell. Cloud Post was one and done. You got one tournament with this thing and then no more ever again. Do we need to change our minds on that now?
I think that the thing that people miss with Cloud Post is that it's not just about cloud posting people. It's what happens when Glimmer Post involves itself in the equation. Imagine if like you played against Amulet and all their bounce lands didn't require them to bounce a land, but then also they like had all the Radiant Fountains. It's just not, you cannot rate, like what would happen when you tried to race the Cloud Post deck? And this is why the fair decks at that tournament became just like Wild Nacatl plus Counterspell. What happens if you just literally try to race is your opponent gets down to about 7 life, and then they play a Primeval Titan, and then they gain, 8 life, and then they have a 6/6 and 8 more life, and a billion more mana, and then you die the next turn. And that just happens every single time. I don't think the Cloud Post experience is great for that exact reason. It's not just the Tron experience, it's the Tron experience where your opponent starts the game at like 26 life. And
yeah.
That's just not great.
I think the key realization with Cloud Post is that people make the natural comparison with Tron, but Tron is a deck that is constructed in such a way that getting Tron is the entry barrier to participating in 95% of games with that deck, and so that suggests this obvious choke point. And if you can keep them off Tron with the wide range of tools that you have in the format to do that now, then your matchup can only really be so bad. Cloud Post is very good at just playing a normal game of Magic, and so eventually you run up with the same issue you have with any of the other Primeval Titan decks, even assuming that's the direction this deck would want to go in 10 years later, which is they just play lands and they cast their 6-drop and then you die because you've stunted your own development and maybe had to like mulligan at least once in the process looking for your hate card. And so, okay, great, you've Alpine Mooned their Cloud Post. Well, the rest of the deck is still functional under that paradigm, and so you can lose to some part of that. And the Amulet decks in that first iteration of Modern, they were the Cloud Post decks, they were powered by Greenstar Zenith, and so without that card in the mix, maybe things change a little bit. But you could build those decks full speed as well if you wanted to. We saw the first glimpse of what Amulet of Vigor could do in Modern, right? With Scape Shift and Through the Breach and stuff like that, and you had these truly wild things happening on turn 3 fairly consistently in those games. But then also, if the game went long, well, eventually they would just hardcast Emrakul the Aeon's Torn or whatever, because that's what the Cloud Post engine lets you do in terms of mana generation. So I think it is more dangerous than a lot of people give it credit for. At the same time, if you have this deck which has this late game inevitability as of turn 7, but is also susceptible to stuff like land destruction and so on in the early game, maybe that's a fine trade-off to have in the format.
I think that you're going to run into the other issue, and like you're starting to force people down a road where they have to interact with lands. And it's different than interacting with Tron, where like, so the thing with Tron is that like when you kill their Urza's Mine before they set up Tron, they have to like put actual resources into finding the other Urza's Mine, and like maybe X% of the time they just have it. But a lot of the time, like you're setting them back multiple turns. My experience playing I played a lane destruction deck at that Pro Tour. I played the like Naya Knight of the Reliquary for Tectonic Edge Boom Bust deck. You are often like trying to set up double LD turns just to tread water to get to the point where like maybe eventually they run out of stuff. I don't think it's because Cloud Post is so like they just need the first post and they have like 4 posts and all the Vesuvas or Thespian stages. And like also all the Glimmer posts they have like threaten the future Cloud Posts being just as bad as the one you just destroyed. I think it's just way too easy for them to like undo all the interaction, like any interaction that isn't Blood Moon or Alpine Moon. I think it's really problematic because of that specific counteraction. It really is not playing in the same realm as Tron.
Yeah, also we have another 10 years worth of cards with which you could construct a Cloud Post deck in a certain way. So I don't even know if the Cloud Post deck of tomorrow, if we woke up and it was unbanned, would be recognizably the same as the Cloud Post deck of 10 years ago with a totally different ban list and some more tools at its disposal like Zenith, but also way less in terms of we've had a decade of new releases since then. So I think the possibility for this to be kind of busted in a way that people don't foresee at first glance is pretty high as well.
Yeah, and I'll point out the thing I would be immediately doing is putting Forethought and Unseer into my deck. Like, this is not like the legacy decks are like really linear and have linearized into like Eldrazi versus this because of like the whole Ancient Tomb thing. I think in Modern you would just have Forethought and Unseer and then like also the Titan thing. You would need to, on the Titan realm, like you need to find something that does like your whatever like isn't Eye of Ugin thing, because that was the kill condition before. But like I assume that, you know, once you've made like 27 mana and gained 30 life, like there's some way to instantly win the game. It doesn't really matter too much.
Yeah, I imagine this would be a good like Khan the Great Creator deck as well, or you can figure it out. We can find a way, I'm sure. So probably not on Cloudpost, I imagine. Let's head back to a pair of cards which they weren't bad alongside each other. One of them had a little more room to breathe before possibly being framed for the crimes of others. Let's talk about Rite of Flame and Seething Song here.
Yeah, I think that these are cards where like it would be nice for the Storm deck to be good. But I think that the thing, this is a consistent, I think Cloudpost too, is that the things that they were banned for might have been powerful at the time. But like, it's like we're 8 years deeper into deck building than we were then. Like, people are just going to do the worst thing possible. And we talked about this with Simian Spirit Guide. What's just going to happen if you unban these cards is people are going to activate Goblin Charbelcher, or they're going to cast Balustrade Spy. And if you ban those cards, they're going to find the next worst thing to do. And I don't think like changing that mana constraint on the format in that way is the greatest. Maybe you could argue me that Seething Song is not a big deal compared to like Pentad Prism or Lotus Bloom. But like the number of times I've just like Ancient Grudged my opponent's Lotus Bloom and continued the game, I think Seething Song is like doing some different stuff. I cannot imagine a world where Rite of Flame gets unbanned and good things occur because of it. Seething Song, maybe. Like, I guess I should remind people that the actual best deck from Pro Tour Philly, like not the like ones that won, like the actual best performing deck was a Rite of Flame Storm deck. And what it did was cast Goblin Bushwhacker and empty the Warrens. And on turn 2, reliably, you would do something between like make 12 goblins and attack your opponent for 28. Like, that's just what every game was. And it was miserable. And it would be great if that didn't happen again. You should probably cap things not accelerating on turn 1. And Seething Song, it's just like, these are the kind of cards that just create the worst case scenarios. And it's not great to keep creating those.
Yeah, I think Seething Song, you can make an argument for in terms of it subsidizes like turn 3, turn 4, somewhere in between kind of combo decks. Like, if you want to be like casting Hive Mind ahead of schedule, then Seething Song is a good way to do that. Or Seething Song into Through the Breach, if that's like the earliest thing you're doing, is probably within the bounds of what's acceptable. So I feel like having that kind of mana boost where like Song jumps you up by 2, which is more than Desperate Ritual, Pyretic Ritual, or the first Rite of Flame, but it also requires this more substantial buy-in. I think that's a good place for that trade-off to be, versus Rite of Flame, where like all it does is enable the degenerate stuff to happen that much faster, and then sometimes you draw 2 copies of Rite of Flame and you actually like do have the possibility of turn 1 kills or whatever, which is kind of funny when it happens 1 out of 500 times, but anything more than that gets into kind of dangerous territory.
Yeah, I guess we did discuss unbanning Blazing Shoal. I would assume unbanning Seething Song is a safer, or is at least in the same ballpark of safe. The decks that it creates are probably less interesting because they aren't gated on going through a creature, which just like inherently makes it more like polarizing game 1 scenarios. Seething Song is probably, I think it would probably end up for me like a bit behind Blazing Shoal in terms of safeness of unban, but like still in the like, if it happened, I don't think it's a great idea, but it probably wouldn't be horrible.
Yeah, the circumstances of its ban were much more opaque than many of the other cards on this list as well, where it gets banned in like early 2013 with the reasoning that, Storm was becoming a little bit too popular, when that claim on the face of it wasn't true. And also Storm wasn't even winning that much. And one of the reasons that Storm was that popular to the extent it was on Magic Online was just because it was the cheapest deck by a gigantic margin in an era before card rental services and what have you. And so something always felt wrong about that card going down in the way it did. That being said, that doesn't make it right to unban it now when there's so much more mischief it could get up to back here in the real world.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing that they didn't mention during that context of the Seething Song ban was that there was a specific issue again with this, like, it falls into the same KCI Glimpse of Nature kind of style where what Seething Song specifically created was these early game scenarios where the Storm deck was incentivized to like short combo, like the way people remember Storm over the years since is a lot more deterministic just because of the way the gifts piles line up. There were a lot more just like these turns where you just like, I don't know, I'm gonna cast Past in Flames at some point and take a lot of game actions, and then like, I don't know, the game will end or it won't end, and I'm not really investing a lot besides the time of my and my opponent's life as we sit here. I distinctly remember playing for an unfortunate 9th place at Pro Tour Seattle with a match that against Tom Martell that took, I think the net total was I killed him turn 3, killed him turn 4, and he killed me turn 2 on game. And it took like a good 40 minutes of clock time because at least one of the games that I won, he spent like 13 minutes fizzling off on turn 2, just like mana filtering and like doing all this stuff from like very tight spots involving Seething Song. And I don't know if that's the play lines you want to promote, but I also don't know if that's how it would end up getting used.
Is that a Storm thing or is that a Tom thing? Storm Martell? Is that? No? Okay, sorry, continue.
I could imagine that some of it is his fault, but I don't think that play pattern of the non-deterministic maybe kill that takes up a lot of clock is something that is unique to him playing Storm.
Yeah, this might fall into like the Second Sunrise or even Sensei Divining Top category where like if you had to get some kind of permit in order to play this card in a tournament where, you had to demonstrate your speed and your facility and so on, then I would be happier about it. But, past a certain point, it becomes one person just sitting there twiddling their thumbs as the other person like stumbles through basic arithmetic. And that's not a great time for anyone. I think between the two of these cards, like I said, Seething Song is much more within the bounds of what modern can and should be. And I think would actually be a pretty safe contender to come off the list. I wonder how much of a boost it would actually be to Belcher, given that like there aren't that many flex slots in the deck as it is, and like does this just replace Ironcrag Feed, or is there other stuff that you like chop around to find room for this? Not quite sure, but I think it would be a fine thing to let back loose on the format. As for whether it will happen, I could kind of see it honestly. If they think the format's in a spot where we've pushed all of the interactive stuff far enough that the safety valves are fully locked and loaded and in place, then maybe this is a safer bet to unban than something like a Glimpse of Nature or Blazing Shoal where, that's always seemed a little more dangerous and a little more mysterious.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I don't think it's, like I said, I don't think it's horrific. It's just it is on the ban list because there is a danger there. Mm-hmm. Let's start getting into the less like, we've talked about cards that do things. Let's talk about cards that don't do things, because we're going to start off with Gitaxian Probe, which is probably the biggest do nothing offender. I was never as like down on Gitaxian Probe as I think the general like consensus was, but I also accept that it not existing is like totally fine. And like, I don't know. I don't think the format is lesser for not having it.
It's I think of maybe all the cards we've discussed here. This would be one of the most confusing unbans because like, what's the point? So the use cases for this card are you make it easier for your linear combo deck to know when to shove, to when to move all in on the Blazing Shoal, for example, and you remove any tension in the game over whether they do have the answer or they don't. Or it enables the incredibly compressed curve blue decks to, make it even easier to get Delirium on their Dragon's Rage Channeler while also pumping their Dash Shadow, or you get to, this is like a Rite of Flame for your Murktide region. It's just all of the same stuff that has been so incredibly pushed over the past few months, and in an even more fun way that removes any kind of fun back and forth gameplay. So no, hard no point. Why would you even consider this?
Yeah, it's no one gains anything from it existing, and it only subsidizes the things you don't want to subsidize. I think we can move along. I think that like there's a large part of like if you asked people like knowledgeable about Magic game design what the like most egregious card ever printed was, well, maybe before 2020, but you know, Luris may be the one that they say now, but I think Gitaxian Probe under current functionality may be the single like most cited like this is egregious, why does it exist card out there, just because it does nothing except for like doing all the things you don't want a card to do.
Yeah, it's still unclear on does it do nothing or does it not do anything, but we'll leave that one to the philosophers for now and move on to some of the latest round of bans to, you know, in an attempt to rescue the modern format here. Let's talk about Arkham's Astrolabe, who arguably this one's reign of terror lasted much longer than it should have, and it managed to, you know, it fed Mox Opal to the crocodile behind it before getting taken out itself.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked about this, right? Like in terms of like this card does nothing, but it subsidizes the exact things you don't want to, which is like we talked about the twin issue where like you have created a Jeskai twin deck, a Temur twin deck, a Grixis twin deck, and an Izzet twin deck. What happens with Astrolabe is you have just created an Astrolabe deck. Like there's no point in mixing and matching any of your color. Like we saw this with multiple cards in like Deathrite Shaman had some of these issues. We talked about that then where like the difference between Ragavan and Deathrite Shaman is that Ragavan creating the many colors of mana is not reliable enough to build a deck that just does it, but it does subsidize if you stretch a little bit. Whereas like if you Deathrite, you can just do whatever you want. Astrolabe is like even worse on that aspect where like you just put it in your deck and then you've created a goober that just says, I do what I want. And then like all the good cards are in your deck for all the colors that you want them to be. And it's not great. It's just you really want people to like make decisions between multiple decks and not like be subsidized on like generic game object plans. And Astrolabe just like it's the like more corporeal version of Gitaxian Probe.
Yeah, I dread to imagine the 4-color decks picking up Astrolabe, you know, having their Yorions be even better with no effort whatsoever, no more mana-based mana screw issues ever again. We get to pick this up and recast it with Teferi, all of the old tricks we've grown tired of long ago. And then also, as you say, there's this issue with cards like this where they aren't interesting in and of themselves. So whether or not there is a risk to Blazing Shoal or Cloudpost or Skull Clamp or what have you, these are at least exciting cards to build a deck around. And it's like, okay, I really hope I draw my Skull Clamp so that I can go off and do all of these absurd things. With Astrolabe, it's, I hope I draw this card so that I get to just ignore the constraints of the mana system entirely, which I guess is exciting in one sense, but it's not a fun moment of tension in the game. It's just, well, now I just get to ignore the symbols on the top right of my cards and just play them in whatever order I want. And so it's kind of, it's not exciting in its own right. And it makes those cards less unique and exciting because one of the things that acts as a fundamental constraint on them just doesn't really exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, Ketria Triumph is just a good execution of this card. And I think we can move on with our lives knowing that card exists, even if I kind of hate it from like a general design prospect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about Mycosynth Lattice, which was banned as part of a batch with some of these other cards here. And that was a little bit of a head scratcher. I wonder if this is a direct consequence of the shocking stat that Sam Black revealed to us that Aldrazitron, apparently the most successful deck over a long, statistically valid, significant time span on Magic Online. And maybe this was a way of cutting that down to size indirectly?
Yeah, I think Lattice is a card where when it was banned, I'm like, why is this banned? But now that it's banned, I don't really think it makes the format better to unban it. I think that if you make that much mana with Karn, you should probably just win the game anyways. And I think that's kind of borne out, right? Like, I can't remember the last time my opponent like had 10 mana minus Karn and then like lost the game, unless it was a spot where they would have lost with Lattice, where I just like had a bunch of creatures and declared attacks and they died. But like at the same time, just like Lattice does not create a fun game state. I think that there's been, and I've said this a lot throughout this episode, I think there's been a big shift in like what the end games of Modern should look like in the last couple years, and going directly from like a combo or linear kill to like you are linearly creating, like I said this before, you are doing something good or like that is perceivable as broken on turn 3, but it's an Archon of Cruelty and not a Gristlebrand. Though that's maybe a little closer than it should be. But I don't really understand what anyone's getting out of unbanning Lattice besides like making EDH players who try to join Modern also mad.
Yeah, I don't think that Lattice needed to be banned necessarily. However, if Lattice never existed and you proposed the idea for the card to someone knowing the card was in the format, their obvious response would be, of course not, what the hell is wrong with you? And I think that's a distinction that comes up a lot here, where there are a lot of cards which there are definite costs to banning cards, like regardless of the specifics of what the card is. And there are a lot of cards which don't really come close to meeting those necessarily, but then once they're gone, you have this like mirror issue of, well, there are also risks to unbanning cards, and why do this unless you absolutely have to? And with Lattice, it's, well, okay, we've seen the one thing, like the literal one thing that this card is capable of doing, which no one really enjoys and which doesn't add anything to the format. So even though if this card disappeared from the list tomorrow, whatever, I don't think too much would change. Why bother? Why would that actively be a choice you would make?
Yeah, and I think that the important difference between like that and like some other nonsense thing like Narset to Fairy's Puzzle Box is that like it would just happen. Like people just want to play Karn anyways, therefore Lattice would happen to you. Like there's no extra effort involved in it. It's just like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of like an equivalent would be like, what if we unbanned Ayavugan, but only if you found it with Primeval Titan? It's like, what? Why? People just want to play Titan anyways. Like, why would this, like, why is that part of what you want to extend the experience to be? There's just no point. I mean, if you want, again, this is another like philosophy thing where like it could be unbanned if there was a much cleaner Modern ban list and you're just like, I want to like wipe the slate clean and make like a very clear statement about this. But like, I think no matter what, you're still probably looking at, even if you unbanned all the reasonable cards or close to reasonable cards, you're still ending up with like 40 cards on the Modern ban list. So like just having this one banned too, just like whatever, be done with it. It's not even like a card that's like regularly reprinted for like exciting reasons and that like someone might open in a booster pack and be like, wait, I can't put this in my like 87 card casual pile. It's just like, no, it's a card from like freaking Darksteel and like some master set. Like no one just like has a Mycosynth Lattice lying around and is like, I want to play Modern with it. That's just not how it works.
I do see the case that philosophically the ban list should be as small as possible, and it should only be the cards which have proven themselves to not be tolerable in the format anymore. And by that metric, yeah, Lattice would get a free pass. But once you get to the point of, is the ban list 40 cards or is it 60 cards in a card pool of 18,000 cards or however large it is now, then I think you're just kind of haggling over the edges at that point.
Yeah, the world is better with this card not in the format, and we can continue with it continuing to not be in the format.
Yeah, let's talk about Field of the Dead. So this was one that was taken out as part of the hard reset on Modern, which was this year. It's kind of wild to think about, but I guess 10 months ago at this point. And I don't think anyone really misses Field of the Dead, but I don't know if it quite needed to go at the same time.
I think so I guess part of the question is whether the problem was Field or Uro, or like both of them together, or what the deal was. I think that this may be the kind of thing where like if you banned Primeval Titan and then like Field of the Dead could maybe be unbanned along with Green Sun Zenith. I don't think you really want to add the Field of the Dead aspect to the Titan decks. Doesn't seem like it. Like there is a significant difference between what Field of the Dead does and what like just finding like an Urza Saga or whatever does, where like you just like clog up the board and like who cares what your opponent's doing, and like even if they kill the Titan, like you survive a turn and then like take a bunch of other actions that like create a million more zombies and you win the game. I don't know if like a raw Field of the Dead deck would be good unless it was also a Titan deck. I mean, it was all Uro and Primeval Titan with Field, right? There wasn't just like, I don't know, Field with some other cards.
Yeah, your actual Valakut deck would play one Field as a backup plan or whatever. Or I guess now that the green-white Reclaimer deck whose top end was Titan back in the day, but now it could be like Titania or something instead, that would, I imagine, still have Field and be like a decent contender with that back in the mix.
Yeah, I think that all we're really doing talking about a lot. There's like there's been 2 or 3 cards we've talked about where the question is like, is this card better on the ban list or are we better off banning Primeval Titan? I don't know if anyone wants to really hear that argument, especially you or the rest of the population of Canada.
We sure don't. No.
But like, I think that is a lingering discussion that like probably won't happen as long as Amulet Titan remains contained in some fashion.
Yeah, I think as it stands right now, like the drawback to putting a 6-drop in your deck is so high, and you really have to just build your deck with the entire end game of that in mind, that I think that is a valid reward for going to all of that effort, but I could understand why people might feel differently there. I think the issue with Field of the Dead and the irony that underlines the card is, while on the surface it promotes diversity in the sense of, yeah, you can't just put all of the same lands in your deck and there's an incentive to mix it up. What that means in practice is fetch lands get even better because they can both beat lands with unique names and find more lands with unique names, and then also get 2 triggers once you have Field, so you're just pushing that angle of the format even further. And then the only unique lands that people are really incentivized to play are like, well, this instead of 2 forests, it's 1 forest and 1 snow-covered forest. Look at me, I'm so clever. Or, you know, my 4-color deck, previously I had 2 Triumphs. Now I have 2 Triumphs and a Sheltered Thicket. Like there's no actual choice going on here. And then on the back end,
I just realized that I had it. So many of these decks just didn't really do the freaking pathway thing. Oh, God.
Oh, that too. Yeah. And then there's also like, once you have enabled the card and activated it, there is no variety because this is just the entirety of your game actions for the rest of the game, and you don't need to do that. Like, at least nowadays, with the current crop of Primeval Titan decks, you do run into these spots sometimes against like 4-color control in longer games where they can actually just grind through 2 copies of Urza Saga pretty easily, or you can't safely go full Valakut because they have ways to kill your Dryad at instant speed. If you could just get 2 copies of Field of the Dead, that's it. You have understood the assignment and accomplished it, and you don't need to do anything else. You just play the same Simic Ghost Chamber 3 times a turn for the rest of the game, and that's it. And you have crossed the finish line there. And just the bar that puts on the format to any kind of fair deck hoping to attack on the ground in combat is just so high that it is so obnoxious. Just for as much as I have a lot to thank the card for, it's so... Yeah, there's no point. Don't do it.
Okay, that's totally fair. I just looked at a 4-color mana base and realized that like they would just put 2 Field of the Dead in their deck instead of a Time Warp or whatever, because their mana is literally multiple copies of fetch lands and then all 1-ofs. I guess they have like 2 Snow Cover Forests now because of Ice Bank Coatl, but they would just play a regular forest.
Or just not play Ice Bank Battle. You could also do that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you don't really need to Ice Fang if you just like plan to accelerate your mana a bit and then like Field, because that beats the crap out of Death Shadow too.
Right. Let's move on to Mystic Sanctuary. So this was a card which I think this may be the easiest ban decision in, I'm not going to say the entire history of the ban list, because we have covered some pretty egregious cards in this series of podcasts here, but just in terms of like, you put anyone who has followed the development of the modern format in the room at any point during this card's lifespan, it would be out of there in a hurry.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's better than Golgari Grave Troll and Sensei's Divining Top. And yeah, it's probably in the bottom 5 to 10 in terms of like why. Just like, what are you... It's so horrible to turn all of the control deck's lands into like a good top deck in the future, then also subsidize this loop, but then also like make fetch lands into spells. Like, why? And like every mana base has to look the same because of this stupid freaking card. And like, I don't know. It's from Throne of Eldraine. Just burn it.
Yeah.
Just this is, you know, we got through talking about Oko, and I was like, maybe Oko in the future we can have a discussion, and we just get to this card, and I'm just like, yeah, no, never. You know what? We're just done with that whole set. Like, maybe, you know, give it another like 14 years, and maybe we'll be done talking about it. But oh my god.
Yeah, once upon a time, somehow not the most obnoxious card in Modern, maybe not even on the podium from its own set. Like, it's wild to think about. But yeah, think about Mystic Sanctuary now in a format that has like Counterspell, Unholy Heat, Expressive Iteration, which is obscenely good with on both ends of this card. Like, it's all of the ingredients of a blue deck now are so much better than they used to be that like the idea of looping this with Cryptic Command feels like faintly quaint and antiquated now. Like, why would you bother casting a 4-drop when you could just cast the same 1-drop or 2-drop yet again and just burn your opponent into the ground that way?
Yeah, I'm good without ever discussing this card again. And let's. I think we're almost at the end here, so that's good. That's good.
I have one final point on Mystic Sanctuary, and I think that one thing that made this such an easy call to ban, and why it was so egregious that it lasted as long as it did, was that in a way it was a free card to put in your deck, and then also a free card to ban, because firstly it's an uncommon from your most recent set. No one's shedding any tears. I mean, maybe Zach Allen has like foil Mystic Sanctuaries that he paid a pretty penny for, but for the most part, every deck that had Mystic Sanctuary could exist without Mystic Sanctuary, but it would just have to rely on, you know, casting more than one different spell in the same game, or just like actually doing different things, as opposed to just doing the one same thing over and over again. So all you do by banning it is everyone gets to play their same deck. There's no one who has to retreat from Modern with their tail between their legs. And then those decks are all cut down to size, and the experience of playing against them is so much better, and the experience of deck building with those decks is so much better, because you the gameplay itself is better, and then also you don't have to homogenize your mana base where, like, yeah, maybe my Emery deck wants to play a single Manamo or something. That's cute, but I can't do that because I have Mystic Sanctuary in my deck, and that just obliterates any possible trade-off or counter-argument in the other direction. And so, yeah, I think every single factor you could possibly think of pointed towards this being a super easy ban. And a lot of these arguments, I think, transfer quite well over to, like, the recurring topic, which maybe we need a 4th episode just devoted to this, but, like, when I think about Lurrus and its effect on Modern, I see a lot of echoes of Mystic Sanctuary there, just in terms of, like, how free it is, the repetition that it leads to, just the hoops you have to jump through just to compete with that card on any kind of fair axis. Like, it doesn't... I see a lot of similarities there, and it's not like a one-for-one read across, but I don't know. It's something to consider.
I will say, this reminds me, Max McVitie tweeted literally today, Dryad Arbor was the secret first companion. The deck constraint was having a Dryad Arbor in your deck.
Yes.
Mystic Sanctuary is the precursor to companions, which the, you know, constraint was having a Mystic Sanctuary. I do think Lurrus sort of... Sanctuary pushed things in the wrong direction, where, like, there's this issue where, like, the big control deck was always good against the small control deck, but, like, you could run it out of specific answers, and that just never happened. Whereas, like, Lurrus is, like, fighting the reverse of that, where it's, like, keeping the small ball decks in the game against the bigger decks, but, like, not really burying the decks that are trying to undercut those with more answers. It's just, like, producing more threats, where, like, it does create slightly better gameplay incentives, and, like, isn't literally free. It actually costs 6 mana to produce. But, like, yes, I agree that Lurrus is the more debatable version of this topic. And yeah, Mystic Sanctuary was not a good choice.
Yeah, let's close out this whistle-stop tour of the Modern ban list with the greatest trick that the devil ever pulled here, Ari.
Yeah, Tybalt's Trickery.
Bullshit.
You know, I could be convinced that this card is okay. I think that the Glimpse... so I don't think there's a big fundamental difference between the Tybalt's Trickery decks in Modern and the versions of Glimpse of Tomorrows that we don't see anymore.
Okay, I think the difference there is... Weirdly, I think the Trickery decks are actually better, as much as that might pain me to say. But then also, they are so much more one-dimensional in terms of, like, at least with Glimpse, there's a question of what your inputs are and how many, like, Chancellor of the Forges plus Ley Lines plus Colony Gardens.
I'm not talking about that deck. I'm talking about there were Glimpse decks that literally were the Tybalt's deck, but with Glimpse.
Right. I mean, more in terms of, like, you at least have to think, okay, how do I fudge a bunch of free permanents into my deck, and how do I, do I wait so that I can increase that count, or do I sit back? With Trickery, you just fire it off. There's no waiting, there's no back and forth. It's just, here is the one thing that my deck is constitutionally capable of doing, and we'll see if you have a response. And if you don't, well, you still have to sit here because, well, I guess you can't hit Simian Spirit Guide anymore. Well, that literally was the one exciting thing about the deck. So, yeah.
They can hit their other Trickery, right? Like, there's the one that's just like an Emrakul and cast 4 Violent Outbursts and Trickery. But, like, the one that actually showed up was the one with, like, 20 Eldrazi or whatever in Trickery. So there's still the out of it not happening. I don't think it's likely this card is unbanned because, like, the end result is not great regardless. But I think if you were to ever argue for, like, this isn't actually good, even if it's egregious when it happens, like, this is the best case argument for that, because it literally is like, this is the thing. There's one thing. This is all that happens. The deck is horrifically constrained, and it probably is not doing anything else.
Yeah, you have people complaining about losing to this card in, like, best of one, standard, or historic, and literally any thread that discusses Arena as a platform. And so I don't think we need to replicate that in another format in, online or offline play anytime soon.
Yeah, that's totally fair that, like, there's a recency pain bias with this card that should not be re-explored. I just don't think it is. I think that it might be in the Lattice realm where, like, unbanning it is, like, not the worst, but, like, leaving it there is also fine.
Yeah, I think this card just would have really matched the vibe of Pro Tour Philadelphia. And there's a good reason that a lot of cards which were contributing to that vibe are not legal in Modern anymore.
Yeah. So I guess to recap, that is, I think, literally every card on the Modern ban list over these 3 episodes. If you were to make, like, a top 4 cards that you think would be reasonable to unban, are you ready to fire off that list?
I'll let you go first because I'll have to work through this in my head quickly, but I think it's a good note to close on.
Okay. I think Preordain is probably the number one in terms of, like, it's like, people actually want to play with Preordain. I think that it would have an exciting impact, but I don't think it would be horrific for the format. Like, it's just, like, all the correct notes, like, very similar space to where Stoneforge Mystic ended up.
Okay. Are we taking it in turns here, or do you have the rest of the list to round out?
I think I ended up with, like, 2 or 3 others. I think a lot of them are from this episode, to be fair, because we did save a lot of the interesting ones for this time.
Yeah, I do have some sentimental favorites where they do fall in the camp of, like, you could, but why would you? So stuff like KCI, which I think would firmly be kept in check now, but, like, I don't know if they want to impose that experience on people again. And honestly, that if you're trying to group up the list and put it into different buckets, that is maybe by far the biggest bucket. Is, yeah, it is probably okay, but
yeah, I think that is a problem that has to be solved. A lot of these I said I would be interested, but I'd have to test it first, which is, like, the other side of that bucket. That's, like, the Glimpse of Natures and, like, the Maniac Skull Clamp call, where it's like, yeah, you could unban it and see what happens, but, like, you might want to test it a little first. I think that it's just, like, the difference between, like, was this card banned because it was too powerful, or was this card banned because it was miserable and powerful? And I think that that's, like, the split there on those 2 distinctions.
Yeah, looking at the entire list now, I'm trying to think of selecting for cards which I think would be safe in the right way, but then also exciting and, like, you can make a case for, as opposed to, it probably wouldn't be too bad. I'm kind of coming around to Seething Song, honestly. Like, maybe I would be swiftly disabused of that notion by some combo deck that needs Seething Song to exist. But as the combo players have had a rough year. I think we can throw them a bone at the very least.
Yeah, I did say 4. I think after those 2 cards, it does get a little tough and you're making a lot of risky calls. There were a few that we mentioned, like Glimpse of Nature, like I said, like Blazing Shoal. where it's like, yeah, you could look into unbanning this, but I think that maybe the third most likely thing is to have that discussion about Primeval Titan and Green Sun Zenith.
Okay.
But you won't it will let you fill in anything else besides the discussion of maybe it's been too long with Titan.
Yeah, I mean, let's get Blazing Shore back. Let's try and live a little bit. I'm sure the first day on Twitch, if Blazing Shore gets unbanned, it's going to be just incredible, just compelling television for all to see. Yeah, looking down this list, I see the logic behind almost all of these cards staying there now that they are there. I think I see fewer like obvious gimmies in terms of unbans than I expected to coming into this. So there's stuff like, I think I came down more firmly on the side of, yeah, you could unban Punishing Fire or Jisei and they would be fine, but like, is that really creating healthy incentives for the format to live with? And with that in mind, I kind of almost want to experiment with like your Maniac Skullclamp core, or maybe also your Maniac Glimpse of Nature core, or just some of the other Maniac options here to liven the format up a little bit.
Yeah, I think that it's we I already made this distinction, but it's the difference between an aspirational card and a constricting card, and I think it's just generally better to look at unbanning the cards that are aspirational before you start looking at constricting stuff. And you can have the format turn in a direction where like something that previously was constricting, i.e., Stoneforge Mystic, no longer is, because Batterskull as a turn 3 play is just outclassed. I don't know if any of the currently banned cards are at that point, especially with the fact that like Punishing Fire, like creatures are moving back into that range pretty reliably. But I think that is what has to happen for a constricting card to be unbanned, whereas like with an aspirational card, stuff just has to move past it.
So with all of that in mind, and with the combined wisdom of these past 3 episodes, if you had to just set free 3 cards, you get to issue a presidential pardon here. What's coming off the list?
Preordained Seething Song, and I would just burn the last one on Tybalt's Trickery, wouldn't I?
Just okay.
No, you know what? I would unban Skullclamp just to see what happens with the it doesn't have to be permanent. Like this isn't like some double. Golgari Greattroll has already proven that double Jeopardy is totally allowed. The third one would be Skullclamp.
Yeah, this is why the suspended list used to exist in Historic for a reason. We can come up with like a similar fudge here, I'm sure.
The probation list,
I mean, honestly, it might be. I think at this point, just clear communication would be a welcome thing above all else. And so if they said, look, we're unbanning this, we're taking a risk on it, and we understand there's a chance it doesn't work out. And if that is the case, we are willing to move fast to restore Modern to where it used to be, then I think people would be understanding of that and willing to, get on that roller coaster.
Yeah, I think that the important thing, if you were to do that, would be to set a definite time frame for reevaluation. Like there's under the knowledge that this could be horrible and it could be gone in 2 weeks, or in 6 months we will actually do an evaluation and say whether it's going to persist until something bad happens or whether we're gonna put it back in the box.
Yeah, I think the most compelling idea that I can recall from our discussions is if you were able to do some kind of Faithless Looting switcheroo where you don't have to worry about Dredge being the obvious thing to do with this, then just in terms of reactivating a lot of cards that ended up in shoeboxes in 2019 through no fault of their own and making people really excited about the possibilities of a card, then I think that would be it. But as you say, I think some other measure would have to be taken alongside that, and I don't know if they are willing to do all the work they need to do in order to unpack that and actually make that a clean transition.
Yeah, I liked your persist argument, where I think there have been cards printed since the Faithless Looting ban that are dependent on it remaining banned. And I like the faithful salvaging, where you are creating specific targeted incentives to bring those cards out of shoeboxes without accidentally making turn 2 Archon of Cruelty a reliable thing.
Yeah, honestly, so we started this off with a discussion of the modern banlist gauntlet that was taking place on Magic Online at the time. This is kind of making me want a gauntlet where you get to put exactly one card from the ban list in your deck and just have that be a gauntlet or some kind of temporary diversion in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that would be pretty cool. There are definitely some... like, for example, we talked about Glimpse. I don't think you like Glimpse plus Skull Clamp would probably be like way too much. And, you know, Seething Song, I guess Seething Song plus Preordain may be one of those things that is also a little bit too much. But I think that like one at a time, it's interesting to look at a lot of these cards.
Yeah, I think that it has to be at most one card on the list at any given time. And then also, I don't think you get useful like A versus B testing out of this, because whatever the best card or best deck enabled by one of these cards is just becomes this buzzsaw that obliterates everything else in all likelihood. So like, I don't know, the best Dread Return deck or the best Ivorian deck, to use an obvious layup or what have you. But with that in mind, maybe that would be a fun thing to keep people entertained over the holidays. But with that in mind,
I do have
yes.
one comment. You would get to live everyone's dream of having their exact one artifact land unbanned.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, well, we get to see which of, Tree of Tales or Vault of Whispers actually emerges supreme.
Yes.
So with all of that in mind, we'll take a final break here and we'll come back with some nonsense of the week.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
All right, let's finish things out here with Nonsense of the Week, which we kind of skipped through last time. That was a fairly short segment, but we are here with an apology and a healthy dollop of nonsense to make it up to you all.
Yeah, so we've had an interesting split of like weird multicolored and weird monocolor stuff this week. I think it's probably more interesting to start on the multicolor side because we can chat a little bit more about the actual decks, and then get into M. Hayashi doing M. Hayashi things yet again. So this is the first one of these is Bring to Light Shift Footfalls, where it's just like a Scape Shift and a Valakut and some mountains that make the Footfalls deck into a additional one card combo deck. The interesting part of this to me was that it was only 60 cards. It didn't like, you know, like there's this incentive when you are like Bring to Light Scape Shifting to just like put more cards in your deck because your mana constraints are weird anyways. But maybe the Triumphs just like fully solve that.
Yeah, maybe you this is like a Doomwake angle where you just add 20 more cards and some Solitudes and just a bunch of like random Charizards and Uno cards, and you know you fill in the blank somehow. I remember in the very early days of MH2, Michael Majors was actually doing some like Bring to Light Footfall stuff where I think he had like a one-off Niv Mizzet as your big top end thing to bring to life for, and when Niv Mizzet resolved, you were going to draw like at least one Cascade spell the majority of the time. So a lot of cool stuff going on there. And once you venture into this this wonderful space, there's a few ways you can take it. But the whole like Bring to Light Scape Shift angle is not one that I'd really seen before, which this could also be if you wanted to make a larger deck, like a Dryad Bring to Light Valakut angle too. But then I think Dryad like pulls you in a bunch of other directions that run up against this. Yeah,
too many lands, and then like the Dryad thing where like you want like the correct cheap interactive spell, but you don't even get to select that because you're a Cascade deck. I do like the sideboard here, which is just like Firewalker or Sanctifier. You can do those things to your opponents too if that's good.
Yeah, I did see a screenshot on Twitter earlier of a Crouching Footfalls and a Surge of Tomorrow just hanging out, coexisting peacefully in the Suspend Zone or the Exile Zone, which warmed my fragile heart. I don't know, this is kind of an interesting concept. I do like that the almost obligatory one-off Valky to bring to Lightfall is actually off limits in this deck because you can cascade into it still, but not with the kind of devastation as a result that we saw in the early months of this year.
It costs 2. You are allowed to cast the part that costs 2. Those are the rules.
Yeah, don't know why we're allowed to bring to life the side that costs 7, but we'll leave that up to other people.
Yeah. So this next deck, I believe, popped up a few people 5-0ing with it in a specific, like one of the most recent league jumps. I don't know if the origin was Aspiring Spike or Terra Norman 09, but this is I think we've mentioned this a bit, that like General Ferris Recuric is like a pretty powerful and exciting card that just hasn't quite found a home. And this felt like the next evolution of it, which is sort of taking, if you remember a few months back, there was the Jeskai Stoneforge deck that won challenge. And this is sort of like, yeah, this is transplanting a lot of the lessons of that into the General Ferris shell, where it's a Chalice Jeskai proactive deck with like Metamorphose and Expressive Iteration as the multicolor cards that trigger General Ferris. So I thought that this deck was pretty darn cool.
Yeah, I'm not fully convinced just because you do only have those 8 threats, and without the... So we've seen the General in a lot of these 4-color or even 5-color shells where Renin 6 is both the perfect thing to curve into General and the most obvious thing to trigger General in a cheap way, and then Omnath as well as a 4-drop, just cohering perfectly with all of that. Whereas with this deck, I feel like the games where you don't have the fast Geist or the fast General, or you can't protect one of those 2 cards, then you're just kind of like spinning your tires, not really doing much. But I like a lot of what is going on here, and so I like the idea of pairing General with like Teferi and Chalice and Iteration and so on. I guess that is just what Spike has been doing this entire time for months now. But yeah, something in that space I think looks pretty good to me. We also had, I guess, Slowgurk, the Overslime, making his first appearance here in the decklist dump. I saw Canister streaming with this earlier to a decent amount of success, it looked like. So this was kind of fun to witness.
Yeah, so this is like Slowgurk as Seismic Assault, Life from the... Like, there's 2 Life from the Loams and 4 Slowgurks in this deck, if that gives you any indication of where things are at. The text on Slowgurk, which is... there's just a lot of it. This is the 1 blue-green 3/3 trample slime from Midnight Hunt that gets counters whenever lands go to your graveyard from anywhere, and then, like, can remove counters to return itself to your hand, and then, like, when it leaves the battlefield, you Life from the Loam. So you're just doing Seismic Assault stuff with this. I do like how this list gets to use Dragon Rage Channeler with Slowgurk, and like you're setting up the whole thing where you like use the Surveil to put counters on it and then pick up the lands to do things. And you're also an Expressive Iteration deck, which is nice. I would really like to get the 4th Expressive Iteration into this deck over like literally any random card in it, but that's a minor complaint. Also, 22 lands is weird here.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of deck where you build it around this cute combo and then you make it a kind of like consistently good deck by adding Dragon's Rage Channeler, Ragavan, Tarmogoyf, just the conventional good cards. And then you realize the next step to making this deck truly competitive is to cut the Seismic Assaults that were what drew you to the deck in the first place, and just, you know, they could be the 23rd land and the 4th iteration and the 4th Unholy Heat, and your deck would probably be better in the end, as much as that pains me to say.
Yeah, maybe you're right that this person has just built Isn't Murktide, but they put different cards in it. That might be the problem.
Basically, I still want to pair like Slowgurk with Urza Saga at some point, and hey, maybe this is the next step in the Zuma Jund life cycle or whatever. But I'll leave it to them and their marvelous minds to work on that. You mentioned M. Hayashi, and of course my ears are going to perk up at that. What spices he have for us this time around?
Okay, well, the Hammer of Vagardens are still in the deck, but the Wild Cantors have joined them.
Okay, we didn't have enough good one-drops in the past, or?
There's 4 Ragavan, 4 Wild Cantor, 0 Dragon Rage Channeler.
Okay, tell me more.
I think that's all you need to know. The rest of the deck in M. Hayashi fashion is all 4s. We've got Spikefield Hazard, Relic of Progenitus, Bolt, Chandra Dress to Kill, Pyromancer, Seal of Fire, Blood Moon. I just wanted to make note that Wild Cantor has joined the Red 1-drops squad to subsidize these Blood Moons and Magus of the Moons and Pillages.
Yeah, it ramps you into a 3-drop on turn 2, and they can't even block it. It's insane.
Yeah, there's a Trinisphere in the sideboard. You're just reliably casting that on turn 2. What are they going to do about that?
I just realized, hear me out here. If you're looking to cast General Kirich on turn 2 and then trigger it for free, essentially, there's no better card for that job than Wild Cantor.
That's a very smart thing to say.
And if you have any smart thing to say to us, then you can find us on social media, as always, at Domin Harvey and at ARMLX. You can find us attempting to say smart things in our columns every week over at StarCityGames.com, and possibly some smart things in store on next week's episode coming to you then. But until then, we'll talk to all of you again soon. Take care, everyone.